James was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. We believe James Ormiston is King James' true father. James was born on the 19th of June, 1566 at Edinburgh Castle, and as the eldest son and heir apparent of the monarch automatically became Duke of Rothesay and Prince and Great Steward of Scotland. He was baptized to Charles James, author James Charles, on the 17th of December, 1566 in a Catholic ceremony held at Stirling Castle. The King James Version, also the King James Bible and the Authorized Version, is an early modern English translation of the Christian Bible for the Church of England, which was commissioned in 1604 and published in 1611, by sponsorship of King James VI of Scotland and I of England. Noted for its majesty of style, the King James Version has been described as one of the most important books in English culture and a driving force in the shaping of the English-speaking world. It is considered one of the important literary accomplishments of early modern England. James convened the Hampton Court Conference in January 1604, where a new English version was conceived in response to the problems of the earlier translations perceived by the Puritans, a faction of the Church of England. James gave translators instructions intended to ensure the new version would conform to the ecclesiology and reflect the episcopal structure of the Church of England and its belief in an ordained clergy. In common with most other translations of the period, the New Testament was translated from Greek, the Old Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic, and the Apocrypha from Greek and Latin. In the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, the text of the Authorized Version replaced the text of the Great Bible for epistle and gospel readings, and as such was authorized by an Act of Parliament.
Ormiston Genealogy Continuation Part 2.
58, Mary Stuart signed at Fontainebleau the three documents which made Scotland a fief of France. In consideration of the protection always given by the kings of France to her realm, and the care that had been taken of her, Mary by Henry II, she declares that if she should die without heirs of her body, she gives in pure and free donation to the kings of France, present and to come, all her realm of Scotland, and all her rights and claims to the crown of England, and the king through Cardinal Lorraine accepts the gift, to the profit of the crown of France. As if this were insufficient, Mary next undertook that Scotland and its entire revenue should remain thenceforward pledged engaged to France until the whole sum of 1,000,000 crowns in gold was paid as a return for the expenses that had been incurred by the king in the defence of the country, and to crown the iniquity, Mary affixed her signature to yet another document, by which she, July 4, 2013-19, divested herself of the power of ever retracting or annulling the free donation she had made of Scotland to France, in default of heirs of her body. It is obvious that the terms of these documents were not communicated to the Scottish emissaries, who, however humble they might be, would not have dared to confirm this betrayal of Scotland. And in justice to the Hamiltons, but the matter can hardly have been kept so secret that James Stuart, Mary's base brother, had no inkling that something was being done underhand. He was now 26 years of age, and was known to lean to the side of the reformers, as against France. And as one of the emissaries was actively engaged in settling the public treaty, in which the interests of Scotland were duly safeguarded. His suspicions may have been strong, but he was as yet powerless to act. The lesson was not lost upon him, though all went smoothly on the surface. Except for some distrust when the Scottish ambassadors replied in answer to the French demands that they had not brought authority to crown Francis as their queen's consort. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 24 April 1558. At the age of 16, Mary married at the Notre Dame Cathedral the Dauphin François, eldest son of Henri II, and Catherine de' Medici. At the public ceremony, mercurial Paris went crazy with joy. For over 200 years no Dauphin had been wedded on French soil, and for motives of policy it suited the Guises to show by the splendour of the feast how completely they had brought Scotland under French tutelage. The ceremony was a brave show, and it was meant to be so, for it signified much more than the rejoicing over the marriage of a boy and girl, however highborn. It seemed to be, so far as men could see, the final triumph of the Guise and Papal party in France and the deathblow to English Protestant hopes of redressing the possible union of the Catholic powers against the Reformation, by ranging Scotland permanently on the side of the anti-Papal party. Mary Tudor was known now to be fading away childless, and her death would certainly bring to the surface the strong Protestant elements in her country. With Scotland inimical and Catholic, they might be crushed, and the Reformation in Europe defeated, and the Guises thought that surely now they held Scotland in their grasp, to be used in their own behoof when the time for action should come. Mary Stuart had been their puppet, for they had reared her from her infancy to July 4, 2013-20, played the part. But in the later stages of her maidenhood, and during her short married life, she must have been a willing one, consciously partaking of the Guise aims and sacrificing everything to serve them. In a hastily written letter from Mary to her mother, dated on the day of her marriage with Francis, first printed by Mr. Hay Fleming, a most significant passage occurs which shows how ready and eager Mary was to subordinate the interests of Scotland to the aims of the Guises. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 1558. When the death of Mary Tudor was imminent, a firm peace and union was negotiated between France and Spain, with a secret agreement to the effect that both powers were in future to join forces to extirpate utterly all manifestations of heresy throughout Europe. Mary Stuart's friend and sister-in-law, Elizabeth, still almost a child, was to be married to stern Philip, instead of to his son, to whom she had been promised. France was to be allowed a free hand to make Scotland Catholic by force, as a counterbalance to a potentially heretic England, subsequently to be crushed. And in return, France was to refrain from the disturbance on the Flanders frontier, whilst Philip branded his doubtful Dutch and Flemish subjects with the withering sear of Spanish orthodoxy. It was a pretty plan on paper, but, as events turned out, it was stultified, because its framers left out of account, or underestimated, the strength of certain factors which had to be reckoned with: the envy of the French and Scottish nobles, the ability and facility of conscience of Elizabeth Tudor and Catherine de' Medici, the distrust and hidebound stolidity of Spanish Philip, the natural strength and attractiveness of the principle of religious liberty, and finally the lack of moral control, which, with all her devotion, handed Mary Stuart thralled into the hands of the enemies of her cause. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 17 November 1558. The long-foreseen death of Mary Tudor, Queen of England, radically changed the aspect of affairs, and the arrival of Knox in Scotland almost simultaneously with the insolent attempt of the regent to suppress by force all religious rights, but those of her own church, Marie de Guise, was a signal for open resistance to her authority, and the sacking of the monasteries by the rascal multitude, then made the July 4, 2013-21, regent understand that the forces arrayed against her were not only those of greedy nobles and sober ministers, but a considerable body of the hitherto condemned and disregarded common people, who understood neither political intrigue nor merely verbal protest. Though civil war was averted for a time by hollow treaties, the Union of Protestant Lords, thenceforward the Lords of the Congregation, became an active power in the state, looking yearningly towards the new anti-papal Queen of England for help and support, and forming a permanent party opposed to the French and Catholic domination of Scotland. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Accession of Elizabeth I, England. James Ormiston was among those agents authorised to represent Marie de Guise's interests in France as well as Arran's. 21 April 1559. The first letter written by Mary and her husband Francis to Elizabeth on the conclusion of the Treaty of Peace certainly gives no hint of any unfriendly intention on their part. In the letter, which was carried by Lethington, William Maitland, on his way from France to Scotland with the ratification of the treaties of peace, Elizabeth is addressed, naturally, in her full title of Queen of England, and is assured of the desire on the part of Mary and her consort. But the evil seed of suspicion had already been sown, and English statesmen were sourly looking upon the young Queen of Scots as the enemy of their country. The first note of this feeling is seen in a letter from Sir John Mason, one of the peace commissioners, who reports to Sir William Cecil that the Queen of Scots is very sick, and these men, i.e. the French, fear that she will not long continue. Mary, in good truth, appears to have been in very delicate health at the time. She had suffered frequently from various illnesses before her marriage, but the heart weakness, probably arising from indigestion, which we have seen troubled her even as a child, seriously threatened her life during her short period of wedlock in France. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. June-July 1559. Throckmorton watched suspiciously and jealously the proceedings of Mary and the Guises in Paris. They were winning English Catholics by bribes, and, July 4, 2013-22, pensions to join their party. They were inquiring as to the number of ships at Elizabeth's disposal. They were busy preparing a strong French force for Scotland, under their brother the Marquis d'Elbeuf. and the English ambassador was persuaded that Mary Stuart and her uncles intended at the earliest opportunity to attack Elizabeth, simultaneously on the side of Scotland and in the Channel. With such news as this speeding to Elizabeth by every courier, it is not surprising that she should on her side encourage the Scottish rivals of the House of Guise. The Hamiltons had been ousted from their preeminent position by French Guisan intrigue. They were, it is true, poor creatures, both father and son, but their right was undoubted, and they were good enough tools for the Queen of England while she wanted them. The eldest son of the ex-regent Duke of Châteauroux, the Earl of Arran, was in France where he had been reared. And secret messengers Randolph Killigrew and other trusty diplomatists, skilled in Scottish affairs, were sent backwards and forwards from Elizabeth to him, and to Throckmorton in Paris, to urge him to action. This was the time, said they, with half Scotland in arms against the French and priestly tyranny, for him by a bold stroke to seize power as a native prince, and, with the aid of England, to assert his exalted birthright. A more splendid bait even than this was held out to him. The Queen of England herself was unmarried. What if he became a favoured suitor, and ruled over England and Scotland jointly with her? Note from Geo, this is young Arran in France, where he had been reared. He was nearly idiotic, but the suggestion was too tempting to be foregone, and he forsook the French for the English. But his interviews with English agents, secret though they were, did not escape the vigilance of the Guise spies, and he was peremptorily summoned to the French court to answer for himself. With infinite cunning, and through dire danger for both, Killigrew managed to smuggle him out of France across the Swiss frontier, and afterwards to England, though proclamations ordered his capture. Dead or alive, and whilst it suited English interests he was used and befooled. It will thus be seen that the insatiable ambition and unstatesmanlike rashness of the Guises and their niece had dragged England and Scotland once more to the brink of inevitable war before the signatures of the peace treaty were well dry. The escutcheon business, puerile as it was, whilst useless as an assertion of Mary's claim to England, July 4, 2013-23, could not fail to irritate Elizabeth, and Throckmorton was ordered to remonstrate with the king and the constable. That Mary personally was an approving party to the intrigues for which Cardinal Lorraine is usually held responsible, and of which Throckmorton says young Francis himself was the head, is proved by the reply given by her to M. de Montesson, who was ordered to capture Arran. The Frenchman apologized to the Queen for having to take such measures against a kinsman of hers, and she replied that he could do her no greater pleasure than to use the Earl of Arran as an arrant traitor. Throckmorton, when telling this story to Cecil, recommends that it should be insinuated as much as possible into the ears of the Duke of Châteauroux and the Hamiltons, in order to irritate them and the Protestants against France. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 10 July 1559. Mary became Queen Consort of France due to the untimely death of Henry II of France. This year also marked the violent start of religious unrest in Scotland. Mary's half-brother, now titled Lord James Stuart, had become prominent in his own party, and was one of the Scottish commissioners in attendance at the Queen's marriage with the Dauphin. July 1559. Harmony seems to have existed for a time between Mary and her mother-in-law. To judge indeed from Mary's own correspondence and the observation of contemporary writers, they seem to have been an exceedingly united family for the few months after Henry's death. Mary never fails to praise her husband for his goodness. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Of note, in December 1559, James Ormiston wrote to 150, the English Warden Forester describing himself as bailiff to Lord Bothwell and seeking Sir John Forester's advice. 1560, Lord James Stuart was sent to France as the envoy of his party to secure his half-sister's consent to establish the Reformed faith in Scotland and to complete a treaty with England. 20 January 1560, Marie de Guise, as Regent of Scotland, wrote to the Scots Secretary of State Maitland in London, asking him to deliver 2 enclosed letters to James Ormiston, with haste. Marie had just received the letters from the 18-year-old Queen Mary. Apparently at this time Marie was aware that both Lethington and Ormiston were at the English court. In the same year with the Duke of Châteauroux and many notables he, Ormiston, 152, was forced to join the English army. Geo noted, Mary could not have sent letters to Ormiston from France if she and her mother did not know and trust him. 1560, that Mary had gained entire power over her husband, and knew it, is shown by a letter she wrote to her mother in the early spring. The cause of the papal party had been going badly in Scotland. The expedition of the Marquis Elbeuf to aid his sister Marie of Guise had been dispersed by storm, and the Queen of England's army and navy, supporting the lords of the congregation headed by Châtel-Harold and his son, had driven the French soldiers of the Queen Regent into their fortress of Leith. Marie of Guise herself had been formally deposed from the regency by the Lords, and both the English and Scottish Protestants had assumed the authority of Mary to abolish the government of foreigners by force in Scotland. Cunning William Maitland of Lethington, the brain of the revolt, fiery Knox the tongue of it, and Kirkcaldy of Grange the strong arm, with the ambitious Stuart bastard, had together contrived to weld into a solid force Scottish impatience of religious dictation and patriotic repugnance to armed foreign government. England was now openly in the field on the side of the Scots as against France, a fit return for the pretensions of Francis and Mary to the crown of England. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Geo made note, spring 1560, all hell breaks loose in Scotland. Mary wrote to Ormiston in December 1559, January 1560. Marie de Guise forwarded letters to Maitland, who was in England apparently at this time, see above, January 1560. July 4, 2013-25. 10 June 1560. Unhappily, the health which Mary so passionately wished for her mother eluded her. This gallant woman, who faced an alien people and attempted to do at least the best she could in the cause of peaceful administration, was severely stricken with dropsy. She was seriously ill before November 1559, and by this time was far gone with the disease. Marie de Guise died in Edinburgh Castle at midnight on this day, only a few weeks before the final settlement of the Treaty of Edinburgh. June 1560, Marie de Guise herself on her deathbed recognised how fatal had been her brother's ambitious policy with regard to England and Scotland. She saw James Stuart, Murray, and other leaders of the congregation, and admitted the unwisdom of the policy she had been forced to carry out, begging them as a last resource at least to be loyal to their sovereign. Her daughter. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 18 June 1560. The news of the death of Marie de Guise was known in France on this day, but was kept from her daughter until 28 June. With good reason, as it turned out, for Mary Stuart's grief when she finally did receive the news was heartrending, and she underwent one of the physical collapses which inordinate sorrow was apt to induce in her. Michiel, the Venetian ambassador, had already paid tribute to Mary's devotion to her mother, saying that she loved her mother incredibly, and much more than daughters usually love their mothers. Now he reported, the death of the Queen Regent of Scotland was concealed from the most Christian Queen, Mary Stuart. June 1560, with this bitter blow, the declining health of the young king, and the consolidation of the anti-papal party in France under the Bourbon princes, the Guises were perforce obliged to confess themselves beaten, and subscribe to Elizabeth's hard conditions. Mary of Guise herself on her deathbed recognised how fatal had been her brother's ambitious policy with regard to England and Scotland. She saw James Stuart, Murray, and other leaders of the congregation, and admitted the unwisdom of the policy she had been forced to carry out, begging them as a last resource at least to be loyal to their sovereign. Her daughter. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. July 4, 2013-26. 1560. The death of Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, suggested strongly that she needed to return to Scotland. Marie de Guise had endeavoured to conserve for her a Catholic kingdom, although there was a peace agreement among the Scots, English and French. Scotland had rejected Catholicism and turned predominantly Protestant in sentiment. Given the extensive turmoil and financial support provided to the rebels by Elizabeth I of England to the Protestant lords of the congregation, who were now leading the Protestant rebellion, Mary was confronted with the Catholic philosophy to rule a Protestant country. 6 July 1560, the Treaty of Edinburgh was signed, by which the French troops were to be immediately withdrawn from Scotland except a few at Dunbar and the Inch, and in the future no foreign soldiers were to be sent to Scotland without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, which was in the future to be supreme. The government being thus made more absolutely a constitutional monarchy than even England was at the time. The right of Elizabeth to the crown of England was unreservedly acknowledged in the treaty. Parliament was understood as an assembly of the bishops, titular abbots, and nobles, with a few members to represent the burgesses of the greater towns, but in practice the higher nobles, each attended by an armed retinue, usually disposed of matters as they pleased. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 29 August 1560, the English ambassador to Scotland Randolph writes to Elizabeth's chief minister Cecil that James Ormiston would shortly be in England to meet with Cecil. The Duke of Arran too sends Ormiston to convey young Arran's son secretly out of France. Ormiston's servant Nisbet is to ride straight away to bring the Duke's 153 son to the French border or into Flanders where Ormiston shall receive him. Another letter from Randolph to Cecil has two enclosures. One states that at the border court at 154, Jedburgh some disorder was committed before both wardens by James Ormiston and John Rutherford of the Know. The Lord Lieutenant warded them both pending punishment. Geo noted, staged, Rutherford was Ormiston's in-law. August 1560, Geo noted, James Ormiston was sent to Flanders. October-November 1560, Catherine the Queen Mother in France was taking a more prominent share in the government, seated by the side and even taking precedence of Mary Stuart, for the growing weakness of Francis foreshadowed her own supremacy, and her keen intellect was busily engaged in conciliating or dominating various interests, in preparation for the great change that she knew was imminent. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 5 December 1560, Queen Mary did not long remain both sovereign of Scotland and Queen Consort of France. Her husband, King François II, died on this day. After a disastrous reign of 16 months, there was no one to weep for him but his young widow Mary at the age of 18. Catherine the Queen Mother leapt at one bound to the supreme power as regent for the new King Charles IX. The Bourbons, the Montmorencys, the Chatillons and the great Reform Party in France, England and Scotland, found themselves freed, as if from a dread nightmare, for the most unpopular man in France, Cardinal Lorraine, was no longer supreme master, and the fascinations of his niece had lost their potency to command the resources of a great nation, and serve the policy of her mother's house. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. December 1560. For weeks Mary remained isolated and shut out from the light of day, seeing no men but the new king, a boy of 9, his younger brother, the King of Navarre, Constable Montmorency, and her uncles. Brantemay's testimony as to Mary's intense sorrow for her loss is very valuable. He says that, whilst he knew her, she never recovered from the pallor which her grief produced on her face. It is a somewhat curious reflection that has not, I think, yet been made, that the oft-quoted poem written by Mary herself on her bereavement, tender as it is, gives us a key to the real state of her feelings, and to the apparently contradictory contemporary statements with regard to them. Throughout the poem it is her own condition that she pities, not a word of sorrow for the premature cutting off of the life of young Francis, or grief at the suffering he had borne. Her own loss of pleasure, the waste of her beauty and youth, the absence of something. July 4, 2013-28. That ministered to her individual well-being, the occurrence of a misfortune are the main burden of her railings against fate. There is no reason whatever to doubt her sincerity in this respect, and the discontented pity she felt for herself, at having her life and ambitions thus early dislocated, was quite compatible with a keen watchfulness through her tears for another chance that might restore to her a position as advantageous as that which she held before her husband's death. On the very day of the king's death, Throckmorton sounded the alarm as to Mary's possible second marriage. Everything was in confusion at Orleans. The Guises thought Throckmorton would not surrender their supremacy without an armed struggle. And if things be slept till the house of Guise, if they have the government and disposing of the new king in this realm as they had, find the means to marry their niece to the said new king, things will remain in the same state they are now in. Brantamey, like a good Guisan as he was, says that King Charles was afterwards madly in love with his sister-in-law, and would have married her if he had had his own way, and the English ambassador probably read Mary's character aright when he said that, as far as he could learn, she would have no objection to such a match, as she more esteemeth the continuation of her honour, and to marry one that may uphold her to be great, than she passeth to please her fancy by taking one that is accompanied with such small benefit or alliance, as thereby her estimation and fame is not increased. Almost with vehemence, therefore, Throckmorton urged his mistress to seize the opportunity of approaching the Queen Mother and Anthony of Navarre with messages of sympathy, and thus to strengthen their hands against the Guises and the papal party. Elizabeth lost no time in acting upon the advice, but before the Earl of Bedford could be dispatched upon the mission, all Europe was planning marriages for Mary Stuart. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 10 December 1560. The other letter this date gives the names of those at the Dunbar Convention, which included the Laird of Ormiston. James Ormiston was about 45 years old at the time, and his marital status was widower. Randolph in his letter to Cecil adds that on the day of truce at Ridingburn, Ormiston was charged with possession of stolen English oxen. Ormiston challenged his accuser to fight and cast his glove at him. Till the matter could be decided, Ormiston and the accuser were, July 4, 2013-29, commanded to ward, one to be at St Andrews, a Scots resort, and the other at St Johnstone's. Of note, there is no further legal record of this incident. Geo notes, staged argument, 22 December 1560. Chamberlain, the English ambassador in Madrid, saw the Duke of Alba soon after the news of the death of Francis arrived there, and the conversation naturally drifted to the subject. Did the Duke think that the French would allow Mary to return to Scotland? Tentatively asked Chamberlain. No, they probably would not, replied Alba, but rather that they would seek to have the disposing of her again. This spiteful remark of Alba gives the measure of sincerity of the new Franco-Spanish alliance, just cemented by the marriage of Philip II with Elizabeth of France. Even to bigoted Alba, a heretic England under Elizabeth was better than a Catholic England under French influence. The discourse of this court, says Chamberlain, upon the Scottish Queen widow are diverse. Some think with dispensation the French will seek to match her with the new king, others with one of the uncles, the Prior of St. John, some talk of the Prince of Spain. Others remember the King of Denmark, and the new King of Sweden. Randolph, the English agent in Scotland, reported that the Scots were talking of a match with the King of Denmark. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. The King of Navarre was anxious that the Earl of Arran should be the happy man. Arran immediately snapped at the bait. He had already found out that Elizabeth had only made a tool of him, and he sent a Captain Forbes hurrying to Anthony of Navarre, with all sorts of pledges and promises. He had been told how patent a way God hath made to match him, being heir apparent, with her that is already in the right of succession. Knox was a strong supporter of the idea, and in fact, the match seemed to be the best suited to secure peace for Scotland. It is plain, however, that Mary would never have consented to it, though she was very gracious to Forbes when she saw him, nor was Elizabeth in love with the idea. She knew how weak and unstable Arran was, and that he would be mere clay in the hands of Mary and Lorraine. Châtelherault also was against his son's marriage with Mary, whom he deeply distrusted, and Arran himself soon grew alarmed, and went to Randolph full of excuses to be sent to Elizabeth. Geo noted, this is July 4, 2013-30, Châtelherault's oldest son. It was the son forcing the issue, and that by this time young Arran had all of France he wanted. Also noted that James Ormiston was sent to Flanders August 1560. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 14th March 1561. Some 3 months later, Elizabeth's agent Randolph further writes to Elizabeth Cecil that the Scots' new regent Arran II, 155, will shortly send to the English court a special man, namely, James Ormiston, to advise of matters that Arran, now the Scottish regent, desires to discuss with the young King of France and the Constable. Ormiston sent to France at the royal direction. This Arran II, also known as James Hamilton, was the second Earl of Arran, and the now widowed, and by command of the King of France, the new Duke of Châtelherault, and as approved by the assorted Scots nobles, the reigning regent of Scotland. Arran was strongly suggesting the marriage of his son, Arran III, and the newly widowed Queen Mary. James Ormiston was dispatched to extricate and bring young Arran III back to Scotland, as the French learned he was not only proposing his marriage to Mary while negotiating with English envoys for his own hand in marriage to Elizabeth. The Guises, promptly recognizing that Catherine would never let her little son Charles, however lovelorn he might be, fall into the net of Mary and her uncles as his brother had done, strove their utmost to promote a marriage between their niece and Philip's only son, Don Carlos. Philip feigned to entertain the idea, for it was a powerful lever by which he might move Elizabeth to his ends. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. March. April 1561, Mary herself stayed quietly in the convent at Rheims, of which her Aunt Renée of Guise was abbess until the middle of April, and then travelled to Joinville to sojourn with her saintly grandmother, the Dowager of Guise. Geo made note, where twins were sent. Whilst she yet remained at the French court, she had sent 4 Scottish envoys to Scotland to carry assurances of regard and promises of forgiveness for past acts to her people. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 14th April 1561. The Queen was on her way from Rheims to Lorraine when Leslie, Bishop of Ross, met her at the village of Vitry. All that the wit of the priest could urge was fervently pressed upon her to cause her to beware of the Protestant and English party, who, without her consent, had weakened almost to extinction her royal prerogative, and had penalized the exercise of the faith in which she was so strenuous a believer. Above all, said Leslie, Let her be cautious of the Stuart bastard who had assumed the leadership of the party that aimed at reducing her to the position of a puppet ruler of a heretic realm. Let him be seized in France and rendered powerless for harm, and Mary might land in Huntly's country surrounded by the Catholic nobles, and overshadow the heretics. But Mary knew well that the Catholic party in Scotland was not strong enough without foreign support to crush reform, and without a great marriage foreign support she could not hope for. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 1561. Lord James Stuart knew where the real strength behind him was. And as he rode with his sister towards Nancy, Lorraine, even her offer to him of the regency of Scotland during her absence could not win from him a pledge to forsake the friendship of Elizabeth of England, or abandon the Protestant faith that he had embraced. But Mary Stuart let him go under the belief that his commission as temporary ruler of Scotland should follow hard upon his heels to Paris. And only after his arrival there, and his secret conference with Throckmorton, was the news received that the Queen had changed her mind, and had determined to look alone to Huntly and the Catholics for support. Throckmorton says that James gave him a full account of what had passed with Mary and the Cardinal, and says that she would not allow her brother to accompany her to Nancy, Lorraine. This aroused his and Throckmorton's suspicions that the Spanish marriage was afoot. Mary, they said, would not ratify the Treaty of Edinburgh until she arrived in Scotland, nor would she marry Arran nor the King of Denmark. She looked no longer towards France, says Throckmorton, but rests her hopes alone upon the King of Spain. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 1561. Lady Lennox was also anxious to promote a marriage between her son, Darnley, and Mary. She dispatched him to France with messages of condolence on the death of July 4, 1332, Francis II. Mary is said to have received him in the dual chamber at Orleans, in the first days of her widowhood, and to have listened to the suggestion of a future alliance. The suggestion of marriage is documented as angrily opposed by Elizabeth, for the very reasons which made it unwelcome to the young queen and a section of her nobles. By this threatened marriage the two nearest claims to the English succession would be amalgamated. Mary's title to the English throne, or that of her children, would be greatly strengthened if she survived. Elizabeth, to avert the marriage alliance and subsequent danger to her throne, offered her love Leicester as husband to the Scottish Queen. Elizabeth's interference was obvious to Mary, and thus created the denouement Elizabeth was desperately trying to prevent. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 14th of August 1561. Mary remained sorrowfully in Calais for 6 days, awaiting the safe conduct from Elizabeth that came not. But at length determined to face the risk of capture, she bade farewell to most of the brilliant train that had accompanied her so far, and embarked on one of the 2 beautiful galleys that rode in the harbour. With her on the galleys were 3 of her uncles, the Duke d'Aumale, the Grand Prior of St. John, and the Marquis d'Elbeuf. The maids of honour who had been her companions from infancy, the 4 Marys, were also near her, and a crowd of French and Scottish noble ladies and gentlemen, who were willing to brave the risks of such a voyage for her sake. Amongst them were 2 men, who perhaps at the time but little attracted her attention, but who nevertheless were in the dim future to sway her fate and die miserably for love or lust of her. One of them, broad of shoulders, stout of limb, was a young Scotsman of 25, whose characteristic was strength rather than beauty. Stubborn red hair, cropped close, covered his massive head, and a great warlike beak of a nose overshadowed a mouth of enormous width and a heavy jaw. But yet, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, was no boor. He had been reared at the French court, and was fully conversant with all the graces of his time. The other man was cast of a different mould, a Frenchman Chastelard, a mere lad, a dangling courtier of the newer school that had become fashionable in the last 2 years in France. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Mary takes possession of her father's throne. Amid her lords and ladies gay, slowly she ambled on her way. Priest, abbot, layman, all were there, and presbyter with look severe. There rode the lords of France and Spain, of England, Flanders and Lorraine, while serried thousands round them stood, from shore of Leith to Holyrood. The Queen's Wake. Mary Queen of Scots, a narrative and defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. 19 August 1561, Mary's galleys entered the port of Leith. Little preparation had been made, for people still doubted the Queen's coming. Mary herself saw her country with a sinking heart, and when informed that during the fog she had been in great danger of being lost upon the rocks, she replied that, for her own sake, there was nothing she would have welcomed more than death, though she would have been sorry for Scotland if she had died. As a matter of fact, one of the vessels of the convoy was captured by the English on pretense of suspected piracy, and Mary's horses were landed and detained for some weeks, on the pretext that there was no passport for them to go into Scotland since Mary had not signed the Treaty of Edinburgh before leaving France. With such mutual dread between the Queen and her government, Mary Stuart set foot on her own land. There were no great personages at Leith ready to receive her, except her bastard brother Robert Stuart. And she breakfasted at Captain Lamb's house surrounded by those who had come from France with her. Soon, however, the people began to flock in from Edinburgh, first the Duke of Châtelherault, and then, plucking up courage, there came doubtingly those who most feared her advent. It was an ominous beginning, and Mary was in low spirits. For her ride into Edinburgh there attended her a single horse for herself, and for her train a lot of little rough hackneys shabbily caparisoned. The contrast with past splendour was too much for the overstrung nerves of the Queen, and she broke down at the sight of the sorry equipage, bursting into tears, and sobbing out that this was very different from the rich and beautiful cavalcades she had disposed of in France, and had enjoyed so long. But since she must change her heaven into a hell, she must eke have patience. On Mary's return to Scotland, she treated her older half-brother James Stuart with distinction and favour. Lord James Stuart had previously been the envoy of his party in France. In previous years he had endeavoured on several occasions to win his sister's consent to the establishment of the Reformed faith in Scotland, and to further a new treaty with England. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 20 August 1561. Mary initially travelled to Holyrood as an 18-year-old and 4 months short of 19 years old. On the following evening the young Queen Mary gave her first grand entertainment to her Scottish nobles and ladies. The old Holyrood castle appears to have worn a new face on the occasion, being gaily replenished with the costly hangings and movables the Queen had brought with her from France. Detailed description of the newly decorated Holyrood for the occasion can be referenced from the catalogue of a series of drawings dated 1889, 11-13 September, 1561. Upon Mary's return from France, her birthplace was the object of her first expedition after establishing her court at Holyrood. She rode thither from Edinburgh. Mary was the first lady in Scotland to use a side saddle, and stayed until 13th September. October 1561, there is a record of the expenses, 156, of a pursuivant taking the Queen's request to James Ormiston, as well as Walter Scott of Eydshaw and others, to sign a letter of non-aggression between the Scots and the Kerrs. Of note, James Ormiston is related to the Scots family via his surviving son Walter. 25 October 1561. James Ormiston and other border landowners were summoned to appear at the palace in Edinburgh, and in the Queen's presence, received their valentines, orders of the names of persons culpable of theft and other crimes. The nobles were ordered to seize those accused and take them before the justice at Jedburgh, and to 157. July 4, 2013-35. Report their exploits and actions taken on the borders. Jameson's Scots Dictionary defines a king's queen's valentine as a sealed letter sent by royal authority for the purpose of apprehending disorderly persons. November 1561. Although Mary had only been in Scotland for a few months, affairs had already drifted into a pitiably lawless condition. The Duke of Châtelherault and his son Aaron were sulking away from court, refusing to give up the fortress of Dumbarton, Bothwell, always near the Queen, and thus early assuming the position of her personal champion, Lord James and Lethington growing daily more unpopular and distrusted, even amongst the Protestants, and Mary herself an object of bitter attack and denunciation. Brawls in the court were almost of daily occurrence, either between the craftsmen or the nobles, and Mary on more than one occasion was threatened with forcible abduction, the mad and foolish Aaron being the instigator, and, until later, as will be related, Bothwell, his sworn enemy, being the champion on the other side. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. November 1561. Mary had quite recovered her good spirits, and appears to have enjoyed much better health than in France. The kindest of messages went backward and forward to Elizabeth. There was even a talk of a friendly meeting between them to banish all difficulties, and at the wedding of Lord James, Earl of Mar, soon to be Murray, Mary publicly drank to Elizabeth's health, and handed the golden cup as a token of amity to Randolph. But behind all this gaiety and blandishment, the matrimonial intrigue was busy, and both sections of Scottish nobles, the Catholics and the professed Protestants, were endeavouring to outbid each other, with the object, in either case, of forcing the hand of England. In the autumn, the Catholics of Scotland and England secretly approached the Countess of Lennox, Lady Margaret Douglas, daughter of Queen Margaret Tudor, Mary's grandmother. Lennox had forfeited his estates in France and Scotland when he married Henry VIII's niece, and had since resided on estates granted to him in the north of England. The Countess was fussy and ambitious, sympathising with the Catholic cause. Lennox was weak and vain, and their elder son Henry, Lord Darnley, now nearly 16, a spoilt and pampered boy, brought up by his mother in constant contemplation. July 4, 1336, of his royal descent was, failing Mary, the eventual heir of the crown of England, and it was a clever move of the Catholics to intrigue for a marriage, which, independently of Elizabeth's will, might give to Mary under their auspices the almost assured succession of England by uniting the claims of the two next heirs. But Cecil's spies were everywhere, and before the matter had gone beyond the preliminary stages, Lady Margaret and her husband were summoned to London and placed under keeping. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 4th December 1561. At the palace in Edinburgh, James Ormiston, including other nobles, was summoned to appear before the Queen and her Privy Council. The borderers explained why they had contravened the above-referenced 25 October 1561 bond for suppressing 158 theft and would accept the penalties thereof. In the official Scottish records there is no further reference as to this incidence, or penalties. January 1562. Elizabeth and Dudley made much of Elbeuf. It was said in order to win him to a marriage between Mary and Arran, the most unlikely match in the world now, as probably Elizabeth knew. Arran doubtless still dreamt of the possibility of it, and his foolish plots to kidnap Mary may probably be explained by his fear that the great Catholic marriage was contemplated, which would end his chances for good. The first of these attempts involved the plot to murder Bothwell, with whom Arran was always at feud, and the apparently inexplicable complicity of Bothwell himself in the second plan, March 1562, may probably have been caused by his jealousy at the idea of Mary's marriage with Carlos. After years of bitter enmity, Arran and Bothwell suddenly became inseparable at preachings, huntings and elsewhere. Mary grew suspicious and had them closely watched. One day they rode together from Edinburgh to the Hamilton Castle of Kinneil, and Bothwell opened the matter by saying that he knew Arran was the most hated man in Scotland, both by the Queen and by Lord James, Mar, and Lethington. "If you will follow my advice," he said, "I have an easy way to remedy everything, that is, to put the Queen into your hands, and to take away your chief enemies, the Earl of Mar and the Laird of Lethington." Arran assented at first, and his father, the Duke of Châtelherault, even more emphatically. But Arran lost nerve, and the next day wrote a full, July 4, 1337, confession to Mary. When his father learned of the delation, his rage knew no bounds, and Arran, in fear of his life, shut himself up in his chamber and sent a secret message to Mar through Randolph, praying for aid. He then escaped from the window by twisting his sheets into a rope, and walking half-clad through the night to the house of Kirkcaldy of Grange in Fiefshire, where the poor creature lost his wits altogether, and babbled of witches and devils and the like. His father Châtelherault had no course now but to give up Dumbarton and humbly protest his innocence and loyalty. Thenceforward not even a pretence could be maintained of Arran's fitness to marry the Queen, either by fair means or foul, and the house of Hamilton recedes into the background. But Bothwell was made of sterner stuff. He too hastened to throw himself at the feet of his sovereign, and plead for the pardon which he did not deserve. Mary was righteously indignant with him, for she had piled favours upon him, and he was confined first at St Andrews and then in Edinburgh Castle, whence he escaped during the turbulent times 5 months later, to run his baleful career. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 14 to February 1562. Whilst Mary was closeted till past midnight in her cabinet with Murray and Lethington, giving to the latter his final instructions for his mission to England, the Frenchman concealed himself under the Queen's bed, fully armed with sword and dagger. He was discovered by her ladies before she entered the chamber, and was expelled, the Queen being kept in ignorance of the fact until next morning. When she learned it, she angrily ordered him out of her sights, though apparently she was not implacable, for the poet was allowed to follow the court when later in the day the Queen left Holyrood for St Andrews. On the 14th Mary slept at Burnt Island, and when her two ladies had undressed her, and she was prepared for her bed, Chastelard, who had concealed himself in a private closet, suddenly appeared and approached the Queen. What followed is variously related. Randolph, writing the next day, says that he setteth upon her with such force, and in such impudent sort, that the queen herself was fain to cry for help, and the matter so manifest that no colour could be found to hide the shame and dishonour. The Earl of Murray was sent for, whom the queen incontinently commanded to put his dagger into him, which had been done if God had not put into his mind to reserve him to be justified according to law. This is the testimony of the English agent, who was certainly not well affected towards the queen, and Knox, her self-righteous enemy, was even more outspoken in his innuendos against her. Knox says that the queen always chose Chastelard to dance with her, frequently leant upon his shoulder, and sometimes kissed him on the neck. He more than hints that Mary's conduct towards him was indecorous, more like to the bordello than to the comeliness of honest women. A week afterwards at St Andrews, Chastelard was executed. He died repentant, says Randolph, confessing privately more than he spoke openly. What he confessed Randolph was not told, but Lethington had found to his distress the court already ringing with the news when he arrived in London. And Mary herself shortly afterwards wrote him a secret letter, as he told the Spanish ambassador, giving him the details. Chastelard, he said, had confessed that he had been sent from France by persons of distinguished position, with sufficient means and apparel, in order that he should get a footing in the court and household of the Queen of Scotland, and tried to make himself so familiar with her and her ladies that he could seize the opportunity of obtaining some appearance of proof, sufficient to sully the honour of the Queen. The persons who sent him on this treacherous errand were, according to Lethington, several, but she who gave him the principal instructions was Madame Curaçao. It was said there must have been something in the Queen's expression or manner thus to inspire men with sexual passion rather than high-minded devotion or fear of her. Elizabeth, whose moral conduct, according to all known evidence and presumption, was much more reprehensible than that of Mary, never allowed her slaves to assume the slightest liberty or overt familiarity on the strength of her passing fancy for them. They could but sigh and flatter and fawn when she smiled upon them, or pine and weep when she frowned. And Essex, the proudest of them all, found to his undoing that Elizabeth would be master and mistress too, however fervently she might love. But Mary's qualities were widely different from those of her cousin. She was as tenacious of her sovereign privileges as was Elizabeth, and could be as haughty as she, but when she unbent in her exuberant love of life and avidity for pleasure, she drew men to her by sweet feminine wiles, and the unconscious but powerful fascination of an ardent nature. Unlike Elizabeth, she did not hector her lovers into a condition of maudlin ecstasy, but inspired them willingly or unwillingly, with a passion so strong that it overcame fear and made them bold. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Early in 1562, Mary appointed her natural brother, James Stuart, as her Prime Minister and titled him Earl of Mar. Within a few months later, James proceeded to marry Agnes Keith, daughter of the Earl Marischal. In mid-1562, Mary appointed James Stuart, now the Earl of Mar, as the Earl of Moray. Unlike the previous title, the Moray earldom carried with it enormous grants of land. Most of the estates had reverted to the crown due to having been forfeited by Moray's enemies, the defeated Catholic Gordon family. Mid-1562, there is a record of the Royal Herald conveying a written command for James Ormiston to enter 159, his person in ward within the town of Perth within 6 days. 21 May 1562, Mary had determined to settle a dispute about the house and property of the Earl of Bothwell at Ancram Moor. In a legal dispute, Sir Walter Kerr of Cessford and Sir Andrew Kerr of Cavertonk, his son, bound themselves not to enter the house or to molest the Earl Bothwell and his tenants. Further, James Ormiston, who had lately entered into possession of the property, was ordered by the court to vacate Ancram and to leave only one ploughman to work the land. Legal records indicate Ormiston had an interest in the estate of Ancram, possibly through both his Rutherford relatives and the Scots. 30 May 1562. Queen Mary once again wrote to the Laird of Ormiston requesting him to prepare to accompany her into England to meet with Queen Elizabeth. The order explained that, as she and her whole retinue were to be in mourning for her widowhood, it would be necessary for him and his company to be dressed accordingly. The ongoing mourning process was for Mary's former husband, King Francis II of France. 1562. Lethington was frequently in secret conference now with the Spanish bishop, and Cecil spies must have noted the fact. For a week after the interview just related, Elizabeth had her counteracting stratagem ready, and an astounding one it was, throwing the whole of her rivals into confusion. One day whilst Lethington was chatting with her, doing his best, as usual, to extract some declaration favourable to Mary's claim to the English succession, Elizabeth remarked that, If the Queen of Scots would take her advice and wished to marry safely and happily, she, Elizabeth, would give her a husband who would ensure it, and this was Lord Robert Dudley, in whom nature had implanted so many graces that if she wished to marry she would prefer him to all the princes in the world. Now, for the last 3 years, Dudley's relations with Elizabeth herself had given rise to endless scandal, and it was the general belief that they were married, or in any case ought to have been, and this bold move of the Queen's, offering her own lover as a husband for Mary, took Lethington utterly by surprise. His wits were keen, but he could not follow instantly this sudden shifting of Elizabeth's policy, and it was some moments before he had the courtier's phrase upon his lips as an answer. It was a great proof indeed, he said, of her love for his mistress, that she was willing to surrender to her a person so dearly prized by herself. But he thought that his queen, even if she loved Dudley as dearly as Elizabeth did, would not marry him. Elizabeth must of course have been aware that Mary would never consent to such a match as that suggested with Leicester or Warwick, but it was her fixed policy, and doubtless a wise one in the circumstances, to diminish the importance of the Scottish Queen as an international factor, and sure as she was now that the French ruling powers would not raise a finger to support Mary. It was a clever and a safe retort to the ambitious plans for a Spanish match for Elizabeth to embroil Scottish opinion, and ostentatiously to treat Mary as an inferior vassal sovereign, only worthy to accept such a subject husband as the English Queen might deign to appoint for her. This suggestion of a marriage with one of the Dudleys was not an isolated fact. It was indeed only made plausible at the time by the success that had attended just previously another and more insidious move in the unscrupulous conspiracy of Elizabeth and Catherine de' Medici to discredit the Scottish Queen in the eyes of the world, and reduce her power to cooperate, marriage or otherwise, with the Catholic party in England or on the continent. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 1562. Mary's forces defeat the Earl of Huntly's troops at the Battle of Corrichie. Christmas Day, 1562. Mary indeed was on uncongenial soil. Mr. Knox, writes Randolph, is so hard unto us that we have laid aside much of our dancing. The Queen's mass priest was cuffed by some of Murray's men one dark night at Dunbar, and on Christmas Day none of her musicians would sing, either at mass or evensong. Thus is her poor soul so troubled for the defence of her silly mass, that she knoweth not where to turn her for the defence of it. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 30 January 1563. Writing at this period to the Cardinal Lorraine, Mary asks him to tell the Pope of her wretchedness in this miserable country, and her determination if possible to remedy the evils in it, if necessary at the cost of her own life, which she would deem herself happy to sacrifice rather than change her faith, or approve of any of their heresies. Also, Randolph in his letters to Cecil at this period, promptly sounds the alarm about the signs discernible in Scotland of Lethington's sudden sympathy with the Catholics. I know not why, but many conceive strangely of him. I would to God he had been plainer with my Lord Murray, but while absent he never wrote a thing to him seeming to give him credit. The Queen and he so determined before his departure. He had lately sent the Earl of Eglinton, the veriest rebellious papist in the country, with Mary's commission of justice to punish offences in the country, and had introduced Ruthen, whom all men hate, into Mary's council. The English party in Scotland were therefore already looking upon Lethington as a backslider, though it is difficult to believe that Murray was not secretly a party to his change of front. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Mary 63. Mary, despairing of obtaining by peaceful diplomacy Elizabeth's recognition of her heirship to the English crown, or of being able without a strong force to secure for her. July 4, 2013. 42. Faith supremacy or even toleration in Scotland was determined, if possible, to turn the tables upon Elizabeth, the Protestants, and the predominant parties in France by bringing the power of Spain into Great Britain and changing the secular policy of Scotland, which had always opposed Spain the friend of England, and had clung to France the enemy of both. The Guises, temporarily crushed by the death of their chief and his brother, yet with a strong party still in France, knew that a Spanish domination of England and Scotland, though it would secure Catholic supremacy, would have humbled France and have rendered it impossible for them to use Mary as an instrument for their family or party aggrandizement. They therefore aimed at a match that should make Scotland Catholic, and nothing more. It will be recollected that in the first days of Mary's widowhood Cardinal Lorraine himself had endeavoured to negotiate a Spanish marriage for her. The circumstances, however, had now changed notably. Philip's attitude during the progress of the religious war which raged in France had convinced Lorraine that the Spanish king did not intend to intervene in favor of the Catholics, or to be drawn into serving any interests other than his own. So long as the cardinal and his brother thought that the marriage of their niece with Don Carlos would enable them to use the power of Spain for their own benefit in France, they were eager for the match. But Guise was now dead, the politicians paramount, and the lesson of the past 2 years had taught Lorraine that the marriage of Mary with Carlos would have meant a Spanish domination of Britain, not a Guisan domination of France. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. July 1563. The Spanish bishop sent one of his confidential agents to Scotland, with a verbal message to Mary herself, saying that he had very important intelligence to convey to her respecting her marriage, and begging her to send a trustworthy envoy to London to receive it for her. The messenger left London in the middle of July, and saw Mary during her progress in the Western Highlands. The details of the interview are not known, but it is evident from what followed that the Queen received the message with delight. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. July 1563. In the meanwhile Randolph received from Elizabeth and Cecil his instructions for driving Mary into a marriage which should deprive her of international importance. He was to tell Mary that the plots of Cardinal Lorraine to the detriment of England and to marry Mary to the Archduke were known, and though it was not believed that Mary had any sinister intent, yet such a match would hinder our wish to favour, by all means that we can, to try and determine her right and title, whether she be, or ought to be, by the law of God and man, our next cousin in blood by our father, and succeed us in this crown of England, if we shall depart this life without children. By this message Darnley or Leicester is evidently indicated as Elizabeth's candidate, but to those who are versed in her methods and policy, nothing can be more certain than that both the succession bait and the Darnley inducement, if it was suggested, were insincere. Elizabeth never had any intention of declaring either Mary or anyone else her heir, and certainly did not desire to unite the two Catholic pretenders to her throne in one interest. But the Archduke's match, amongst other possible proposals, had to be defeated, and the course adopted by Elizabeth seemed the most likely to secure the end desired. Mary had just granted to Lethington the valuable estates of the Abbey of Haddington. This may have influenced him to cooperate in her marriage scheme. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 1563. James Ormiston commenced a year-long handfest process with Lady Margaret Sinclair, about 1563. Ormiston was about 47 years when handfested. Margaret's maiden name was Sinclair, also known as Sinclair's St. Clair. She was related to the 4th Lord of Caithness, and a widow of the Honourable Sir John Sinclair, December 1563. Randolph hurried home to England, full of doubts and fears, and carrying from Mary a diplomatic inquiry, intended to delay matters whilst forcing Elizabeth to declare herself more openly. What marriages, she was to be asked, would be, in the opinion of the Queen of England, suitable for her sister of Scotland. Elizabeth, however, had no intention of allowing herself to be drawn prematurely, and Randolph posted back to Scotland with a mere variation of his former message, to the effect that his mistress recommended some fit nobleman within the island, well affected, to concord, but that no child of France, Spain, or Austria would be acceptable, and once more Mary was warned that largely upon her right to the English succession would depend. Mary was ill in bed, with overmuch dancing, said some, with overmuch devotion, said others, when Randolph arrived in Edinburgh, and a few days later, while still in bed, she received him. Elizabeth had sent her by him a splendid ring, which she displayed upon her finger with girlish delight. That and the bridal ring of her late husband Francis must go to the grave with her, she said, and willingly should never be out of her sight. But jewels and fine words were powerless to allay the uneasiness caused by the vague hints and veiled threats with which she knew Randolph was charged. For weeks previously she had been divers times in great melancholy, her grief being marvellous secret, and she often weeps when there is little apparent occasion. But now she grew rapidly worse, until her life was almost despaired of for a week. Thought she evaded the formal conveyance to her of Elizabeth's second message. Randolph reported the opinion that the Queen's sickness is caused by her utterly despairing of the marriage of any of those she looked for, they abroad being neither very hasty, nor her subjects here very willing, or bent those ways. This conceit, say some, has been in her head some 5 weeks or more. Still more unlikely is the other explanation venomously suggested by Randolph as the cause of Mary's illness. The Queen's apothecary had got one of the Queen's maidens, a French woman, in credit, and near about to her Grace's self with child. An attempt to avoid the disgrace by drugs had ended disastrously, and both culprits were sent to prison and hanged. Whether these things are so heavily taken that they can make her, Mary, so sick, as within 8 days men doubted her life, I know not. We can probably make a better guess than Randolph at the real reason for Mary's depression when we call to mind that the death of the Spanish bishop in London, of which she must have heard in September, had dashed for the time her hope of carrying through speedily and secretly the match upon which her heart was set, and which, she knew, Philip was ready to negotiate, and no more. Weeks, perhaps months, might pass before confidential communications could again be established with faraway Spain, and in the meanwhile Elizabeth's arrogant exigency was increasing. Mary did her best to delay matters by remaining in bed, and deferring her critical conferences with Randolph, whilst she endeavoured to get into confidential correspondence with Cardinal de Granvelle in Flanders, and the Duchess of Arschot, who at an earlier stage, as will be recollected, endeavoured to engineer a marriage between Mary and Don Carlos. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots, 21st January 1564, 2 years after Mary's return to Scotland. In order to induce their royal mistress to lay aside her mourning for Francis II, and to choose a successor among the many suitors, the maids of honour, the four Marys, bound themselves by a vow, never to marry if she, Mary Stuart, were not the first. Of interest, the English ambassador, Randolph, a suitor of Mary Livingston, in a letter to Queen Elizabeth dated this day speaks of having used the vow as an argument to induce Mary to accept Elizabeth's suggestion. Lord Robert Dudley, as the proper bridegroom. I commended to her, Randolph says, the felicity of marriage, the joy and pleasure of such children as God may send to her. And if by no means I be able to move her to that which is most for her own commodity and comfort to her subjects, yet, at the least, that she will take compassion upon her four Marys, her worthy daughters and Mignaunces. At the failure of his attempt to conclude a marriage for Elizabeth, the noble maidens seem to have been subjected to a good deal of courtly persiflage. Spring-summer 1564. Mary, if she chose an Englishman at all, would of course only have the best, namely, Robert Dudley, and he surely could not forsake the refulgent sun in England which he worshipped. And if he did, how could a lover so disloyal and fickle ever be respected by any woman again? One of Randolph's curious inducements to Mary to take a husband was that at least she will have compassion on her four Marys, her worthy daughters and minions, that for her sake have vowed never to marry until she does so. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots, 1564. At this time Rizzio, or Riccio, a native of Pancalieri, in Italy, had attracted Mary as a friend. He had come to Scotland as secretary of Moretta, the Savoyard ambassador. Given his musical talents, Mary had asked of the ambassador that he be a part of her household servants. Reportedly, the first occasion he sang was at the Requiem Mass which Mary conducted at Holyrood for Francis II. July 4, 2013-46. Rizzio soon made himself of value to Mary in a variety of ways. He was an accomplished scribe and linguist, as well as musician, and on the post of the Queen's secretary becoming vacant, he was appointed at the recommendation of the Queen's uncle, Cardinal Guise, who advised his being taken in that capacity, because his dwarfish and deformed person would disarm scandal. That there was the least foundation for the whispers in connection with the Queen's alleged passion for him, by which the Confederate Protestant lords worked with the weak-minded Darnley. On balance, Mary's documented appreciation of her kind secretary was that of an indulgent mistress to a sophisticated servant. Mary's duly high opinion of the Italian's talents and fidelity influenced her to the extent as the rancour of the Protestant nobles became threatened and jealous of his importance, and suspicious of him as a foreign papist. And the Pope's delegate. 23 March 1564. On the borders it is noted a bond called the Old Band of Roxburgh documented the feud with Walter Kerr of Cessford, 164, which was referred by the sheriff to arbitration. Walter Scott of Branxholme gave security for James Ormiston. June 1564, Sir Walter Kerr of Cessford, then warden of the Middle Marches, complained that the landowners refused to appear and help him when required. On 28 September 1564, an order was sent to the provosts of Jedburgh, Selkirk and Peebles, and 35 gentlemen, including the 165, Laird of Ormiston, that they were to obey and help the Kerr as warden. 28 July 1564. Further, about 2 years later, Agnes Waldheim, widow of Matthew Windigates of Ancram Mill, Sir James Ormiston's son Walter Ormiston, heir of James Ormiston of that ilk, and his father as his tutor, to desist from keeping her out of the mill. July 4, 2013, 47. In this year it was stated that there was a particularly 163 deadly fight and actionous betwixt Walter Kerr of Cessford Knight and James Ormiston of that ilk, about the occupying of the said Laird of Ormistoun of the lands of neither North Ancrome, and the adjoining lands thereof, also accusing Ormiston of attacking the Laird of Cessford's servant, the servant being the Laird of Cessford's best man who ultimately died as a result of Ormiston's actions. There is no record of prosecution of this alleged confrontation and attack by the Kerrs or Ormiston. It may be noted this Kerr's grandfather married Christian's daughter and his grandaunt Elizabeth married a son of James Rutherford of that ilk, while Ormiston's mother and grandmother were Rutherfords, so that Kerr and Ormiston were related, cousins in some degree. August-November 1564. Although Elizabeth was too modest to give the hint herself, her counsellors cleverly endeavoured to stultify Castelnau's mission, which they knew or guessed, namely, the marriage of Mary Stuart with a young brother of the French king, the Duke of Anjou, barely 14 years of age. Dudley told the Frenchman that there would be no similar objection made if Anjou were offered to Elizabeth. And Castelnau went on his way to Scotland already unsettled with the idea of the new possibilities offered by the hint. Mary received him graciously, and at once told him of the suggestions that had come to her for her marriage with the Archduke, the Duke of Ferrara, several German princes, the Prince of Condé, and with one greater than any of these, the Prince of Spain, whose father King Philip proposed to send him for the purpose to the Netherlands. This was said some 3 months before Mary's eyes were opened to her betrayal in this matter, and in full confidence still of being able to bring about the great match. She answered Castelnau's offer of Anjou by saying that though she loved France better than any country in the world, she could never think of returning thither in a lower station than that she had formerly enjoyed there, or risk losing her own realm, which was so gravely divided in her absence. She loved equal grandeur, and if the Prince of Spain came into Flanders and continued his suit, she did not know what she, July 4, 2013, 48, might do. Here spoke the true Mary Stuart. She would marry no prince but one strong enough to assert by force her right to the crown of England, and to compel Great Britain finally to be Catholic. Don Carlos or Charles IX alone possessed the necessary qualifications, and she was willing to marry either of them. But, as we have seen, the courtship jugglery of Elizabeth, the mutual jealousy of France and Spain, and the determination of Catherine to be mistress of France by balancing one religious faction against the other, made both marriages unattainable by Mary, as she herself feared before many days more had passed. In the meanwhile the Lennoxes and their tall pretty stripling of a son were basking in the sunshine of Elizabeth's court. The confiscation of the Earl's estates in Scotland had never been revoked, and since the arrival of Mary in Scotland Elizabeth had on more than one occasion supported the prayers of Lennox and his wife that the attainder against him might be raised, and his ancestral estates restored. Failing Dudley, it was evident that no English suitor had the remotest chance of consideration by Mary but Henry, Lord Darnley. Lennox was a weak, unstable man, easily dealt with, and one whose religious convictions were of a mild character. But Lady Lennox was fond of looking upon herself as the Catholic claimant to the English crown, and her intriguing fussiness made her a possibly dangerous personage as an instrument in the hands of Elizabeth's enemies. So, Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, was allowed in August to go back to Scotland with Elizabeth's modified blessing to plead for Mary's favour. Elizabeth knew, of course, that Lady Lennox had never abandoned the hope of seeing her boy married to Mary, and acknowledged as heir to both thrones, and Elizabeth's own now compromising dallying with Dudley had made the Countess's hopes stronger than ever. But even if Elizabeth ever meant to allow Mary to marry Darnley at all, which is doubtful, notwithstanding the impression she conveyed to Melville, Castelnau and others, she certainly was not prepared in the autumn of 1564 to let Darnley go without a hard and fast bond, making him and his parents her humble servants if he married the Scottish Queen. Lennox's reception in Scotland increased Elizabeth's distrust. The friends of Knox muttered angrily, and the Catholics bragged that he would go to Mass with the Queen, and that the crown of Scotland would be settled upon him to the exclusion of the Hamiltons, failing issue to Mary. Lennox arrived at Holyrood on the 23rd September, and had hardly removed his riding boots when he was received in state by Mary and her nobles, the Hamiltons of course excluded, all of whom embraced him, and thenceforward the Earl lived in the palace in princely fashion, striving to be all things to all men, going to sermon, or to Mass indifferently feasting with all and sundry, and himself banqueting the four Marys and other delicate dames. Randolph went back to England with dilatory suggestions that a commission of diplomatists should meet on the borders and discuss the terms proposed for the union. In pursuance of Mary's plan to allay Elizabeth's suspicions, by means of a pretended willingness to continue the Dudley negotiations, Sir James Melville was sent south with a mission in the third week of September. Melville, with his courtly foreign graces, was the best envoy Mary could have chosen for the particular mission now entrusted to him. Elizabeth promised him, indeed, that she would make him her intermediary with Mary to propose the Dudley match, but Melville supposed that the influence of the latter caused her only to employ Randolph, her resident agent in Scotland. Elizabeth's real motive in speaking of the matter to Melville in April 1564 was probably only to familiarise Scotsmen with the idea of such a match. See Melville Memoirs. Melville was to assure the Queen of England of his mistress's desire to please her in all things, to apologise for Mary's angry letter about Lennox, to urge her to appoint commissioners to discuss the marriage proposals made to her and other pending questions, and to watch closely the tendency of the Queen and Parliament in the matter of recognising Mary's right to the English succession in conjunction with her proposed marriage. Mary secretly instructed Melville to urge Lady Lennox to obtain permission for her son to join his father in Scotland, to see the country and return to England with him. It has usually been assumed that these instructions of Mary to Melville were based upon her wish to marry Darnley at the time they were given, the middle of September 1564. And there is no doubt that Lady Lennox and her husband were animated by that prospect. Mary was able with a light heart to acquiesce in Elizabeth's plans for her marriage with Leicester, while she was pursuing her own policy and seeking to forward the Spanish negotiations. Melville carried back to Scotland the usual bland professions of Elizabeth's friendship, but nothing definite about the succession. The only real step in advance being the promise of Elizabeth to send Bedford and Randolph to discuss matters with Moray and Lethington on the border. But Melville warned his mistress that the Queen of England was playing false. Thus, in complete dissimulation on both sides, the joint commissioners met on the border secretly in the middle of November. Both sides feigned to treat the Leicester proposal seriously, but both were playing their own respective games, and both desired delay. Mary in order to carry through her Spanish plan, and Elizabeth in order to delay or prevent Mary's marriage to anyone until the dangerous suitors were disposed of, and to distract her counsels in the meantime. In the meanwhile, Lennox, now restored to his estates, was ruffling bravely at Holyrood, spending great sums of money, in order to gain friends against the Hamiltons who were watching him sulkily, and dreading the idea of a possible plan to marry his son to the Queen. Mary had no more intention at this time of marrying Darnley than she had of marrying Leicester, but she was anxious to have him in Scotland with his father. And Lennox was prompted to write to Elizabeth that Darnley's presence in Scotland was necessary for a short time, in order that his right to the entail of his estates should be recognised. However, the Queen withdrew her initial consent for Darnley's journey as soon as it was given, stricken with fear that a trap had been laid for her, and that she might, when least she expected it, find Darnley and Mary married and acclaimed by the English Catholics as the heirs, if not the rightful possessors of the crown. Mary grew more and more anxious as time went on for an answer about the Spanish match that she so ardently desired. Elizabeth finally decided to let Darnley go to Scotland at the earnest request both of Leicester and Cecil. The former because he was anxious to create a diversion from his own marriage with Mary, and the latter because, like his mistress, he wished to embroil her and to prevent her from marrying anyone as long as possible, and they thought Darnley might easily be recalled if his chances began to look too favourable. It must not be forgotten that Lennox and his wife enjoyed great estates and revenues granted to them in England by Henry VIII. With the power to confiscate them in Elizabeth's hands, the latter thought she held a pledge for the obedience of the Lennoxes as a last resource, as the Scottish estates, now restored to them, though very extensive, were nothing like so valuable as those in England. Mary learned from the Duchess of Argyll, in the last days of 1564, that Philip had vetoed the marriage with Don Carlos, and heavy as was the blow to her plans, the Queen of Scots lost no time in changing her tack, in accordance with the new conditions thus created. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 1564. Meanwhile in the palace, rumours of Mary's intended betrothal seem to have got abroad, for the French envoy writes to Catherine de Medicis, "It is confidently said that she will be married before 6 months are past, although I do not believe it can be so soon. She has begun to marry her 4 Marys, and says she means to be of that band." Mary must have released her ladies from their vow by confiding to them her own intention to choose a bridegroom, for about 2 months later the first break was made in the quartet by the marriage of Mary Livingston, Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Spring 1565. Mary Stuart was a young and beautiful woman, healthy and energetic, long widowed, eager to be married. Ref. The personal rule. 11 to 13 February 1565. Lord Darnley secretly left the English court, hastened to Scotland, and met Mary at Westwemyss Castle. Darnley had become an avowed suitor for Mary's hand and was for a week as the invited guest of the Queen. When young Darnley crossed the border, it was to Randolph's utter consternation and bewilderment, as is openly displayed in his letters. So little was Darnley expected by Scotsmen that many thought the newcomer must really be Leicester. The Hamiltons, the Campbells, the Scotts, the Beatons, the Douglases, the Cunninghams, and many others were alarmed, some for religion and some from ancient feuds, at the bare possibility of the marriage of Mary with her cousin. Both he and those friends of the English party whom Randolph could advise received the newcomer with great courtesy. Morton and Glencairn, both enemies of Lennox, welcomed him as cordially as they could, and Murray's brother Robert entertained him at Holyrood in the Queen's absence, whilst Randolph lent him horses. When, after awaiting his father's instructions for 3 days while at his house of Dunkeld in Edinburgh, the youth proceeded to Wemyss in Fife to salute Queen Mary. Up to this period we have seen Mary playing her game with perfect self-command. She was pleasure-loving, light-hearted, and determined to enjoy life to its utmost, but she had so far curbed her inclinations whenever they ran counter to the success of her aims. The kernel of her policy from the first had been the establishment of her prospective, or, July 4, 2013 52, present right to rule England as well as Scotland, and to restore Great Britain to the Catholic Church. There were 2 ways by which this might be effected. First, by her marriage with a Catholic prince strong enough to enforce her claims in conjunction with the Catholic party in England. And second, by a transaction with Elizabeth, in which Mary's marriage with an English nominee should be paid for by her formal recognition by Queen and Parliament as Elizabeth's heir. So long as Francis II lived, Mary had worked in the first direction, but when she came as a widow to Scotland, it was with the intention of adopting the second course, under the guidance of her Anglophile ministers, Murray and Lethington. We have seen how, despairing of obtaining definite pledges from Elizabeth, Mary had reverted to the first plan and had attempted to arrange her marriage with Don Carlos, from which Elizabeth's double-dealing intrigue about the Leicester match had never moved her. When Darnley arrived in Scotland, Mary knew, though unofficially, that the Spanish match was off, but it was obvious that whilst she remained unmarried anything was possible, and her best interests were involved in delaying indefinitely any decision, except the one that would ensure the success of her aims, one way or the other. It was quite evident that marriage with Darnley would not do this, unless it were effected as part of a transaction with Elizabeth, and with the support of the Scottish Protestants as well as the Catholics. The only advantage which such a union could bring to Mary otherwise was the cooperation of the 2 Catholic claimants for the crown of England in case of Elizabeth's death, and the united support of the English Catholic nobles, whilst against this latter advantage were to be balanced the discords and old feuds aroused in Scotland itself by the restoration and elevation of the Lennox Stuarts. It was, therefore, Mary's wisest course to avoid an alliance until she could make an advantageous bargain for herself with one interest or the other, which in changeful times she might always hope to do so long as she remained unfettered. It was on this occasion, the crucial point of her career, that Mary's amorous passion first overrode her diplomacy. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 4th March 1565. The lusty Englishman Semple was to marry Mary Livingston, one of the famous 4. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. March 1565. Lethington and Murray, who were keener men of the world than Randolph, saw that Mary's fancy for Darnley, if it grew much stronger, would make the old diplomatic methods powerless to serve her, and they vehemently protested against any further procrastination on the part of the English Queen. Murray was the sorrowfullest man that may be, and the Scottish nobles who had always supported the English connection were in dismay. Some for religion, some for fear of overthrow of their houses, some for doubt of her marriage with a papist, and Randolph said to Cecil, "I never found in my life so many discontented people here." Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. March 1565. The Lennox Miss papers, drawn up for the use of Lennox himself, assert that the Queen was stricken by the dart of love, by the comeliness of his Darnley's sweet behaviour, personage, wit, and virtuous qualities, as also in the art of music, dancing, and playing. Castelnau de la Morvisiere, who was present, also gives the idea of the suddenness of Mary's caprice for Darnley, by saying that many people attributed it to artificial enchantments. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 15th of March 1565, Mary was reported at Stirling Castle. Darnley was with her and hotly pressing his suit for marriage. 15th of March 1565. In the meantime, whilst Mary was endeavouring to smooth the diplomatic path, the billing and cooing with Darnley proceeded apace at Stirling. Gossips were already talking of this, in conjunction with Elizabeth's even more pronounced philandering with Leicester. Bothwell, who had been a fugitive in England and France since his escape from prison, had just returned to Scotland without licence. With characteristic coarseness he said, just before he arrived, that both the queens could not make one honest woman, and as for his own queen, if she had taken anyone but a cardinal, it had been better borne with. It is fair to say that not one atom of evidence is known to justify the latter vile innuendo, except the general bad character of Cardinal Lorraine, which surely should not be allowed to weigh against Mary. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. July 4, 2013 54. 17 March 1565. Mary's eyes were always fixed on the English succession, and before definitely accepting Darnley she made a last bid to Spain and France for support. Probably at the same time as the courier took Randolph's account to Elizabeth of the grief of Mary, and the desperation of Murray at the definite letter from England about the succession, the Queen of Scots saw Castelnau de la Mauvissiere, the French ambassador, and set before him the reasons why she wished to marry Darnley. Castelnau had noted the growing fondness displayed by the lovers, and foresaw the result, but as his mission had been simply to divert Mary from a Spanish or Austrian match, he had stood aloof during the early progress of the Darnley wooing. The Queen of Scots now told him that she thought the interests of her realm and herself would be best served by her marriage with the young Stuart, but that she would do nothing without the advice of the Queen Mother, and wished before the match was definitely settled to learn the views of Catherine and her son. That very night an agent of the French ambassador was hurrying south with his message, in which Castelnau privately informed Catherine that he considered the courtship had already advanced too far to be stopped. This move of Mary towards her French mother-in-law doubtless had alternative objects. First, to provoke an offer of marriage at once from Charles She, or, failing that, to ensure French support, or at all events to avoid opposition to the union with Darnley. Towards the Spaniards Mary made a similar, and indeed more significant, advance. Lethington, it was said, was to go to England to carry Mary's reply to Elizabeth's final succession letter, and with the pretext of asking the English Queen for a passport for him, a Scottish agent named Fowler was sent to London on the 17th of March. He arrived on the 24th. Having made his request to Elizabeth, he went at night to see Guzman, the Spanish ambassador, for whom he bore a letter of credence from the Queen of Scots. Marriages, as Dufour said, were in the air. Elizabeth was flirting desperately with him for Charles IX. She was dropping strong hints that she wanted an offer from Don Carlos, whilst her marriage with the Austrian Archduke was looked upon by many as certain, and Leicester, in his heart of hearts, was more confident than ever that he would finally win the prize. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Sekel 1565.